Princess Charlotte had always been in the public eye, a charming yet enigmatic presence within the British royal family. Though she was often seen accompanying her parents, the Prince and Princess of Wales, to various engagements, she had largely remained a quiet, composed child, polite, poised, and ever the image of royal propriety. No one expected the young princess, barely 9 years old, to take the podium and deliver a speech that would leave the entire country stunned. But that was precisely what happened on a crisp autumn afternoon, when she took the stage at a grand event held at Westminster Hall. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The occasion had been a formal one, a gathering of political leaders, esteemed scholars, and members of the royal family to mark a significant national milestone. Initially, the event had proceeded as expected: cordial greetings, eloquent speeches from senior officials, and a general air of ceremony. No one anticipated the moment that would come next, when Princess Charlotte, with a quiet yet determined expression, stepped up to the microphone. Her mother, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, exchanged a glance with Prince William. Even they appeared slightly taken aback. The king himself, Charles III, looked momentarily puzzled, his hands resting gently on the golden armrests of his ornate chair. There had been no prior announcement that Charlotte would speak. No speech had been prepared for her by palace aides. This was entirely unplanned. The room fell into an anticipatory hush as she took a steady breath. When she spoke, her voice was clear, unwavering, and filled with a surprising depth that belied her young age. "Today I stand before you not just as a princess, but as a girl who has watched and listened, who has learned and questioned," she began. The hall remained utterly silent, every pair of eyes fixed on her. She spoke of the world she was inheriting, a world both beautiful and broken, filled with extraordinary progress yet plagued by persistent inequalities, environmental destruction, and the ever-growing chasm between those who had everything and those who had nothing. She talked about children like her, growing up in a world where technology connected them, yet often left them feeling isolated. She spoke of climate change, of the irreversible damage being done to the planet, and how it was her generation, not the ones sitting before her, who would bear the consequences. Too often, children are told to wait their turn, to stay quiet until they are older. But the world doesn't have time to wait, she declared, her voice growing more impassioned with each word. Gasps rippled through the hall. The guests, many of whom were among the most powerful people in Britain, were not used to being addressed with such directness, let alone by a child. The Prime Minister sat frozen, a half-sipped glass of water in her hand. A few of the older members of Parliament exchanged wary glances, but in the audience others listened with rapt attention, their expressions slowly shifting from surprise to admiration. Charlotte continued, her young face earnest and determined. She spoke about the responsibilities of leadership, about the duty of those in power to act with wisdom and compassion rather than self-interest. Her words carried the kind of raw honesty that only a child could deliver, without fear, without political calculations, without the weight of an agenda. There is no crown, no title, no wealth that can protect us from the truth. The world is changing, and if we do not change with it, we will be left behind, she stated firmly. The audience sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of her words. But it was her final lines that would be played across television screens, quoted in newspapers, and repeated across social media for weeks to come. "I am just a child," she said, looking across the room, "but perhaps that is why I see what others choose not to see. Maybe it is time we stop thinking of children as the future and start listening to them in the present." A long, charged silence followed. Then slowly the first wave of applause began, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, until the entire hall erupted in a standing ovation. Some clapped simply out of politeness, still processing what they had just witnessed. But others were genuinely moved, their faces reflecting a mixture of awe and contemplation. The king himself seemed to be struggling to hide his emotions. Prince William looked at his daughter with quiet pride, while Catherine wiped away an unnoticed tear from the corner of her eye. The media reaction was immediate and intense. Within hours, headlines dominated news outlets. Princess Charlotte shakes the nation with powerful speech. A future queen, Charlotte's words spark debate across Britain. The royal family's youngest voice challenges leaders. Social media was ablaze with clips of the speech, with millions watching, sharing, and discussing her words. Some praised her eloquence. marveling at how a child could possess such insight and courage. Others questioned whether she had truly written the speech herself or if it had been orchestrated by advisors seeking to modernize the monarchy's image. But palace insiders insisted that it had been entirely her own decision, her own words, something that made the moment all the more extraordinary. In the following days, political figures, activists, and celebrities weighed in. Some politicians dismissed the speech as charming but naive, arguing that real governance was far more complex than a child could understand. Others, however, took it as a wake-up call. Environmentalists hailed her as a voice for the future, urging leaders to take immediate action. Even world leaders made references to her words, acknowledging the power of her message. Despite the whirlwind of attention, Charlotte herself remained largely out of the public eye following the speech. She returned to her usual life, attending school, spending time with her siblings, and remaining, for the most part, the same girl she had always been. But something had shifted. People had begun to look at her differently, not just as a princess, but as a leader in her own right. The monarchy, too, found itself at a crossroads. The institution had long struggled with questions about its relevance in modern society, and here was a child who had, without meaning to, reignited the debate. Would she grow into a future monarch who would reshape the role entirely? Or was this moment an anomaly, a fleeting burst of unexpected brilliance? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. Princess Charlotte had spoken, and the world had listened. In the days and weeks following Princess Charlotte's speech, the ripple effects were undeniable. Discussions about her words extended beyond the United Kingdom, reaching international forums where world leaders, journalists, and scholars debated the implications of such a bold statement from a child of royal blood. Had the monarchy just witnessed the rise of a new kind of royal leader, one unshackled by tradition, one who spoke not in careful diplomacy but in raw, undeniable truth? While the British press oscillated between admiration and skepticism, Charlotte's speech found an even more fervent audience online. Young people around the world shared her message with a sense of urgency, hailing her as the voice of a generation too often ignored. The clip of her standing at the podium, unwavering in her conviction, became a viral sensation, sparking movements across social media platforms with hashtags such as #ListenToTheChildren, #CharlotteSpeaks, and even #FutureQueenNow. Despite the palace's usual reluctance to respond directly to media frenzy, insiders hinted that Charlotte's parents had been caught off guard by the magnitude of the response. Prince William, a man who had been raised with the knowledge that every word spoken by a royal carried weight, now found himself guiding a daughter who had, in one speech, thrown out the script entirely. Catherine, ever the graceful and measured presence within the family, was said to be deeply moved by the reaction, yet cautious about what it might mean for Charlotte's future. For the royal family, the challenge was immediate. How does one balance the role of a child in the firm with the expectations now placed upon her? There had never been a precedent for such a moment. Young royals traditionally remained in the background, shielded from controversy and public scrutiny until adulthood. But Charlotte had changed that with just a few sentences, and there was no going back. Meanwhile, within the walls of Buckingham Palace, quiet discussions unfolded about the potential consequences of Charlotte's speech. King Charles III, though a progressive thinker in many respects, understood the precariousness of royal influence in modern society. The monarchy had always been meant to unify, not challenge, to guide, not to provoke. Yet here was his granddaughter, unintentionally or not, disrupting the very structure of the institution with a message that was impossible to ignore. Would the public demand more of her? Would they begin to look at her not just as a child, but as a figure with a political voice? And most importantly, what would this mean for the future of the monarchy? While the upper echelons of government remained largely silent, a few members of parliament, particularly those from progressive parties, openly praised Charlotte's words. Some even suggested that the royal family should take a more active role in advocating for urgent global issues, rather than remaining neutral. This, of course, was an argument that divided Britain deeply. Many were thrilled at the idea of a monarchy that evolved with the times, one that had a real voice in matters of climate change, social justice, and economic disparity. Others, however, saw this as a dangerous deviation from the institution's purpose. For the young princess herself, life continued much as it always had, at least on the surface. She returned to school, played with her brothers, and attended family outings with the same cheerful energy that had always defined her. Yet there was a subtle shift in the way people spoke to her, the way they looked at her. Even at her young age, she sensed it. It was in the way staff members at official events suddenly seemed more attentive when she was in the room, the way reporters watched her more closely, hoping for another moment of unscripted brilliance. For a child, such a shift in perception could be daunting, but Charlotte had always been spirited, intelligent beyond her years. Unlike her father, who had spent much of his childhood burdened by the weight of expectation, she embraced the newfound attention with a sense of purpose rather than dread. Then came the letters. Following her speech, thousands upon thousands of letters poured into the palace addressed directly to her. Some came from children, young boys and girls who saw her as a kindred spirit, someone who had spoken out when they had not been given the chance. Others came from adults, activists, educators, even scientists, who wrote to her not as a child, but as an emerging leader. Among the letters, one stood out. It was from a young girl in Kenya who wrote about how her village had suffered from the severe droughts caused by climate change. "You are lucky to have a voice that people listen to," she wrote. "Please do not let them make you quiet." Charlotte read that letter over and over. At night, as she lay in bed staring up at the ornate ceiling of Kensington Palace, those words echoed in her mind. Please do not let them make you quiet. The royal family had long operated under the philosophy of never complain, never explain. But Charlotte had never followed that rule. It wasn't in her nature. And now, for the first time, she wondered if she ever could. Then something extraordinary happened. The United Nations, recognizing the impact of her speech, extended an invitation to the royal family. They wanted Charlotte to attend an upcoming climate summit, not to give a speech, after all, she was still a child, but simply to be present, to observe, to meet world leaders and hear firsthand about the challenges the planet faced. The invitation alone was historic. Never before had a child so young been invited to such an event in an official capacity. The palace was faced with a dilemma. To accept the invitation would be to acknowledge that Charlotte had stepped into a role beyond that of a typical royal child. To decline would risk appearing as though they were trying to suppress her growing influence. After much deliberation, it was decided Charlotte would attend. The announcement sent another shockwave through the media. Journalists speculated wildly about what her presence would mean. Would she speak again? Would she challenge world leaders directly? Would she be seen as the beginning of a new, more outspoken royal generation? The day of the summit arrived. Dressed in a simple yet elegant navy blue dress, Charlotte walked alongside her parents as they entered the vast conference hall. Cameras flashed, and whispers spread throughout the room. Here was a young girl who had, without intention, become a symbol of change. She listened intently throughout the discussions, her expression thoughtful as scientists presented their research and politicians debated policies. She met leaders from around the world, shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers, exchanging words with climate activists who had spent their lives fighting for the very issues she had spoken about. She asked questions, intelligent, thoughtful questions that once again reminded everyone that she was no ordinary child. Then, in a moment that would be captured and replayed countless times, she turned to one of the world's most powerful leaders, a man who had repeatedly downplayed the urgency of climate change, and asked, "Do you think your grandchildren will have to fix the problems you refuse to?" The room fell into silence. The leader in question, caught off guard, stumbled over his response. But Charlotte did not press him further. She simply looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded as if she already knew the answer. That single sentence became the headline of every major newspaper the next morning. Princess Charlotte confronts world leader over climate inaction. A future monarch, a present force. Charlotte's question sparks global conversation. Even those who had dismissed her initial speech as a fleeting moment of childhood idealism were forced to reconsider. It was one thing to give a prepared speech, it was another to challenge power in real time. Back in Britain, the conversation had shifted. The monarchy was no longer just a historical institution. It was now, undeniably, part of the present fight for global issues. And at the heart of it was a young girl who had not been raised to lead just yet, but who had already begun to do so. What came next was inevitable. Despite her young age, Charlotte was now one of the most recognizable voices in the world. She was no longer just a princess, she was an advocate, a symbol of the younger generation's demand for action. And while the palace still tried to maintain a balance between her childhood and her unintended role in global discourse, it was clear that the world would not wait. A new era had begun, and Princess Charlotte was leading it. The transformation of Princess Charlotte from a beloved royal child into a global phenomenon was not something that had been planned, nor was it something that could be easily controlled. The British monarchy had survived for centuries by carefully curating its public image, by ensuring that each of its members adhered to an unspoken set of rules governing their behavior, their words, and their engagement with the public. But Charlotte had unknowingly rewritten those rules, and the world was watching. In the aftermath of her attendance at the United Nations Climate Summit, she returned to Britain with a quiet yet undeniable shift in her demeanor. She was still a child, still attending school, still playing with her brothers and friends, but there was an awareness about her now. The conversations she had witnessed, the leaders she had met, the overwhelming response from people around the world, all of it had planted something within her. She understood now that words carried weight, that a voice, no matter how small, could shake the foundation of power. Within the royal household, discussions continued behind closed doors. Some advisors warned that allowing Charlotte to take on such an active role at such a young age could be dangerous, that it could disrupt the delicate balance the monarchy had maintained for generations. Others saw in her an opportunity, a chance for the royal family to modernize, to prove its relevance in an ever-changing world. The king himself remained measured in his response. He understood both sides of the argument, but more than anything, he recognized something in his granddaughter, a quality that reminded him of his own mother, Queen Elizabeth II, a quiet resilience, an unshakable determination. Despite attempts to return to normalcy, the world had already decided that Charlotte was more than just a child. Invitations flooded the palace, international organizations, advocacy groups, even world leaders who wished to meet with her, to engage in discussions about the topics she had so boldly addressed. The palace, however, remained firm. Charlotte would not become a public figure in the way the media hoped. She was still young, still growing, and her education remained the top priority. But the people did not forget her. Months passed, then a year, and yet her speech continued to circulate, inspiring young people across the globe. Schools began incorporating discussions about her words into their curriculum, activists invoked her name in their campaigns, and even some politicians found themselves referencing her speech in Parliament. She had become a symbol, not just of the monarchy, but of a generation that demanded to be heard. Then, on the eve of her 10th birthday, an unexpected event reignited the world's focus on Charlotte. A massive wildfire broke out in the Amazon rainforest, devastating thousands of acres within days. Scientists and environmentalists had long warned that such disasters would become more frequent due to climate change, but this particular fire was unprecedented in its scale. Images of burning trees, displaced animals, and thick smoke blanketing entire regions filled television screens and social media feeds. World leaders issued statements, promising aid and expressing concern, but many activists feared it was yet another example of too little, too late. As the crisis unfolded, Charlotte sat with her parents in their London residence, watching the news reports with wide, troubled eyes. Unlike the other disasters she had seen on the news before, this one felt different to her. It was connected to everything she had spoken about, everything she had urged leaders to take action on. And yet, despite all the speeches, despite all the promises, the world was still watching as the forests burned. She couldn't stay silent. Without consulting palace aides, without even telling her parents, Charlotte penned a letter, one that would once again shock the world. With the help of her school teachers, she wrote a powerful, impassioned plea addressed to world leaders, urging them to treat the climate crisis as an emergency, not an afterthought. She called for immediate action, not just empty words. She wrote of the children who would inherit the consequences of inaction, of the irreversible damage being done, of the need for courage in leadership. That letter, meant only for the desks of the world's most powerful, was leaked. Within hours, it was everywhere. Every major newspaper published it in full. Social media exploded with discussions. and environmental organizations praised her for saying what so many had been afraid to. It was raw, it was bold, and it was impossible to ignore. The response from world leaders was mixed. Some expressed admiration for her passion and commitment, while others, particularly those whose policies had contributed to environmental degradation, dismissed the letter as well-intentioned but naive. A prominent political figure even went as far as to publicly state, "The princess should focus on being a child, not playing diplomat." But the public wasn't having it. The backlash against those who tried to silence her was immediate. Supporters flooded social media, defending her right to speak out. Celebrities, activists, and even former politicians weighed in, praising her courage. Children around the world began writing their own letters, inspired by her words. Once again, Charlotte had ignited something much larger than herself. The royal family now faced a unique dilemma. Traditionally, royals remained neutral on political matters, never expressing personal opinions on issues that could divide public sentiment. But Charlotte had never intended to be political. She had only spoken from the heart, from a place of genuine concern. And that perhaps was why people connected with her so deeply. Behind the scenes, her parents were faced with a difficult decision. They had always been protective of their children's privacy, ensuring they were given as normal a childhood as possible despite their royal status. But Charlotte was no longer just a child in the eyes of the world. She had become something far greater. So, they made a choice. Rather than suppressing her voice, they decided to channel it. They worked closely with advisors to create a space where Charlotte could engage with the issues she cared about without being placed in the center of controversy. They established a foundation in her name, the Princess Charlotte Initiative, dedicated to supporting young voices in climate activism, education, and leadership. The foundation was unlike anything the royal family had ever done before. It wasn't a mere charitable organization. It was a movement, a platform for young people around the world to engage in real, impactful change. Through scholarships, mentorship programs, and international youth summits, the initiative aimed to give children the resources they needed to speak up, just as Charlotte had. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks of its launch, thousands of young people applied to participate. Schools across the UK integrated its programs into their curriculum, and environmental groups partnered with the foundation to push forward meaningful legislation. Charlotte, though still young, took on an active role, not as its leader, but as its inspiration. She met with children from different backgrounds, listened to their stories, and continued to learn about the issues that had sparked her passion in the first place. With every passing year, her influence only grew. By the time she turned 12, she had become a global icon, not in the way a celebrity is idolized, but in the way a leader is respected. She had spoken at international youth summits, met with scientists and world leaders, and even co-authored a book aimed at educating children about environmental stewardship. But through it all, she remained, at her core, a child. She still rode her bicycle through the palace gardens. She still played pranks on her brothers, still enjoyed her favorite books, still cherished the simple joys of childhood. Her parents ensured that, despite the weight of expectation placed upon her, she was never burdened by it. As she grew older, speculation about her future intensified. Would she follow the traditional path of a royal princess, bound by ceremonial duties? Or would she redefine what it meant to be a royal entirely? Would she one day sit on the throne as a queen who actively shaped policy, rather than merely advising on it? No one knew the answer, not yet. But one thing was certain. Princess Charlotte had already changed the course of history. She had reminded the world that power was not measured in crowns or titles, but in the courage to speak, to question, and to lead. And as she stood at the precipice of adolescence, the world waited, eagerly, hopefully, to see what she would do next. As the years passed, Princess Charlotte's influence only deepened. Though she had not sought out the role of a changemaker, the world had placed her there, and she had risen to meet the challenge with a grace and wisdom far beyond her years. She was still a child, still growing, still learning, but there was an undeniable sense that she was destined for something greater than tradition had ever dictated for a royal of her standing. By the time she reached her teenage years, the landscape of global activism had changed in part because of her. Movements inspired by her words had taken root across continents, and the foundation established in her name had grown into one of the most impactful youth-driven initiatives in history. It had funded climate projects in developing nations, provided scholarships for young activists, and brought together children from across the globe to collaborate on solutions to the issues plaguing their world. Despite her continued impact, the royal family remained cautious in how they navigated her growing platform. There were strict boundaries in place. She was still, after all, a royal, and there were expectations that came with that title. She could not openly criticize government policies, nor could she take direct political stances. But Charlotte had never needed to. Her power lay not in politics, but in truth. She did not campaign for parties, nor did she engage in divisive rhetoric. She simply spoke about what was right, what was necessary, what was urgent. At 15, she was invited to attend a special youth summit at the Vatican, where Pope Francis himself wished to meet her. It was an unprecedented honor, not just for her, but for the monarchy as a whole. The meeting was private, away from cameras and reporters, but those close to her later said that the Pope had commended her for her courage, for her unwavering dedication to the future. He told her that leadership was not about power, but about service, a sentiment that resonated deeply with her. Her education remained a priority, and despite her growing responsibilities, she excelled in her studies. She developed a deep love for history, particularly the stories of young leaders throughout time. Figures like Joan of Arc, Malala Yousafzai, and Greta Thunberg, all of whom had, in their own ways, defied expectations to create change. She studied international relations, environmental science, and diplomacy, recognizing that if she was to truly make a difference, she needed knowledge as much as passion. By 17, there was an undeniable truth that could no longer be ignored. Charlotte was no longer just a princess. She was a leader in her own right. As she prepared to step into adulthood, the world held its breath, knowing that whatever path she chose, it would not be dictated by tradition alone. It would be shaped by the fire within her, the fire that had ignited a movement, that had changed hearts, and that, in the years to come, might just change the world itself. As Princess Charlotte approached adulthood, the expectations surrounding her future intensified. Speculation ran rampant in the media. Would she follow the conventional path of a royal, engaging in ceremonial duties and philanthropy? Or would she chart a new course, redefining the monarchy's role in the modern era? The British public, and indeed the world, had grown accustomed to her voice, her presence, her courage. There was an unspoken understanding that she was different from the royals who had come before her. Unlike many of her predecessors, Charlotte had grown up in an era where young people wielded immense influence through digital platforms, where activism was no longer confined to political leaders and policymakers. She had seen firsthand how voices, no matter how small, could create waves of change, and despite the careful management of her public image, one truth remained evident. She was no longer a passive figure in the royal family. She had become an agent of impact. Her 18th birthday was marked by a speech, one that had been carefully planned, yet carried an unmistakable authenticity. Standing before an audience at a global youth summit in London, she addressed the next chapter of her life with a sense of clarity that left no room for doubt. I am incredibly privileged to have been born into a family with history, tradition, and responsibility, she said, her voice steady. But privilege means nothing if it is not used for purpose. My purpose is not to be a symbol, not to be an ornament of tradition, but to listen, to learn, and to act. The audience erupted into applause, but she continued unshaken. There is a new generation rising. We are no longer waiting to be invited to the table. We are creating our own. I stand here today, not as a princess asking for attention, but as a young person who, like millions of others, refuses to stand by while the world ignores the challenges we face. We must not wait for permission to shape the future. We must claim it. It was a declaration that made headlines around the world. The once soft whispers about her potential role in reshaping the monarchy had now become full-throated discussions. Would she be allowed to continue on this path? Could a princess truly balance duty to the crown with her own convictions? Unlike the generations before her, Charlotte did not shy away from the debate. Instead, she leaned into it. She began pursuing higher education, studying international relations and environmental policy at one of the world's leading universities, determined to arm herself with the knowledge needed to turn passion into practical change. By her 19th birthday, the shift was undeniable. She was no longer just the young girl who had stunned the world with a speech. She was a formidable force in her own right. She had stepped out of the shadow of expectation and into the light of her own destiny. And the world watched, knowing that whatever came next, Princess Charlotte was only just beginning. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Princess Charlotte's first ever speech? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.